Hello, Year 10. Welcome to this week's episode of your English Literature podcast. We're talking to you today about the poem Mother Any Distance by Simon Armitage. With you today we have Miss Beaumont.
Miss Rafi.
Mr. Amon.
Right, I need you now to take a second to pause the recording, please, and make sure you have a copy of the poem in front of you. Read through it before you restart the podcast, please. Pause the recording now. Okay, so you should have read the poem, but we're now going to summarise what we think this poem is about. So let's start off. It's clearly about a parent-child relationship, isn't it?
Yep.
So we've got a speaker who's the child, and they are moving out of their house. Perhaps moving into their first house, could be for university or their first job perhaps, but they're clearly moving away. How does the mum seem to feel about this in the poem?
We can see that the mother's really, really attached. We've got a lot of keywords that suggest that she wants to hold on, and she's finding it very difficult to let him go and live his own life. Finding it difficult to accept the fact that he's growing up and he needs his own independence and his freedom. But we feel like the speaker, the child, he's very much sort of the opposite. He really, really wants his flow. He wants to reach out and move on with his life, but the mother is just sort of really, really hesitant. She wants to hold on for a bit longer.
Yeah, that's definitely probably something that you can relate to growing up, and we can probably all relate to, is that feeling as you get older, you want more independence from your parents. To give you a little bit of context about this poet, you can see from when Simon Armitage was born. He was born in 1963, so he's quite a modern poet. And we don't have as much information about this poem in particular as we do about some of the other poems. But what I can tell you is that Simon Armitage generally writes about quite relatable subjects. So he writes about things that most of us will experience at some points in our lives. Another point you could make if you're thinking about the context of this poem, you could also think about the ladder of love. And you could think about how this is an example of a family relationship and how perhaps Socrates would have thought about the relationship that's being presented. So, Mr. Rafi just touched on the idea that there's quite a lot in the language of the poem that suggests that the mum is perhaps finding it difficult to let go. Are there any quotes in particular that we could pick out that would perhaps suggest that the mother in this poem is finding it difficult to let her child leave her nest?
Yeah, definitely. If you look at the second stanza, especially the last line, we've got two very key words. We've got anchor, we've got kite. Now, anchor is the opposite of kite, so the two words are juxtapose each other. The purpose of anchor is to keep something grounded. Now, the purpose of a kite is to be free. You can really get this sense that the mother is almost trying to grab and hold on to the child, anchor him down or her down, and keep the child with them. But the child in this poem can be seen wanting to be free like a kite and explore the world and grow up and experience the things that he can't experience if he stays with the parent or she stays with the parent.
So what we've got there, Mr. Amar, is almost, well, it is, isn't it? It's an example of juxtaposition. And remember, that's when you've got two opposite images that a writer is using to create opposite effects. So perhaps mum is the anchor and the child is the kite trying to reach up into the air. So yeah, that would definitely be a really interesting thing to talk about in terms of the word choices there. So they're both nouns. Anything else about the language that we might be able to talk about in this poem?
With regards to the attachment and not letting go or holding on, we've got the spool of tape. He says, you at the zero end, me with the spool of tape. So we've got that sort of physical connection where they're really closely apart, or close together rather, holding on to either side of a specific thing. So you can see that they are very, very close, and mum just wants to sort of keep held on to him.
Because literally, I mean, it sounds like literally what they're doing there is they're measuring the rooms, maybe to put furniture in or to see how much space they've got. It's something that you tend to do when you're moving house. But it could be that the writer is using this spool of tape as a metaphor as well, as as an image of this distance between them. And with mum being at the zero end, so at the very end of the take, that could be a metaphor for mum being at the zero end of the speaker's life. So when the speaker was born, before he's had chance to add on years and grow up, mum was there right from the start, just as she is holding the tape. So that absolutely is a really key metaphor, I think. I also really like the metaphor on the last line of the first stanza, so on line 4. It talks about the room that they're in having acres of the walls and prairies of the floors. So we've got 2 more metaphors there. An acre is a large area of land, and a prairie is an area of wild land in particular. So it's an area which is very wild, lots of quite dangerous animals might live there, it's very isolated, it's very remote. And I really like that, because when I read this poem, I think about the first time when I moved out, when I went to university, and it's really exciting, but it's also quite scary and quite daunting because you've never lived on your own before. So using all of these metaphors to suggest how big the house seems almost reflects perhaps the way the speaker's feeling, a bit of nervousness about moving out or a bit of anxiety as well.
Yeah, the feeling of anxiety is further continued, especially in the last line of the poem, line 15, fall or fly. Now, fall or fly, the use of alliteration can show quite a few things. So the narrator has essentially 2 choices, whether he's going to fail or whether he's going to succeed. But he's quite excited about the idea of trying to do this himself, this real sense of independence. The use of endless sky, so the narrator can see endless opportunity. They can become whatever they want to be in life, and the only way that they're going to become this person that they want to be is, like you said earlier on, is when essentially the mother can be at the zero end of the life, completely away, so that they can decide what they want to do with their own life.
Definitely. And structurally, the use of that ellipsis on line 13, where it says last 100th minute, and then there's the ellipsis, ... that almost highlights how hesitant or reluctant he is to let go. So this idea that it's not an easy thing to do, but it's going to be something that he has to do anyway. Everybody has to do it, everyone has to grow up. Let's just talk very briefly then about some of the themes, because we've mentioned some of them already. We've talked about how this is a poem about growing up, so the theme of growing up certainly would be something that we could link to lots of other poems. What other themes might we want to think about?
Well, we've clearly got the theme of distance. You can see how we've got they're moving apart in terms of the relationships. We have emotional distance, but also the fact that he's physically moving away. We've got the physical distance also, and we've got a lot of words and phrases that suggest physical space as well. So that shows the distance between them as he's growing up and growing sort of away from his mother.
Definitely, and just to link that back to structure as well, you can see by the use of the white space in this poem in particular, especially if you look at the last stanza, the way the poet's broken the lines up is quite interesting. And on line 11 and on line 15, we've got very short lines with a lot of white space, and perhaps that shows that the speaker's got lots to think about and lots of again, nervousness or anxiety about the situation that he's about to leap into, and that's quite overwhelming for him. So perhaps that use of white space is something that we could comment on as well to relate to that theme of distance. What about, we mentioned that the mum's very keen to hold on and the child's quite keen to let go. If we're thinking about the idea of someone rejecting somebody else, would that link to any of the other poems that we've looked at so far?
I would say 100% this can be linked to follower. You get the sense that the child is quite ungrateful, he doesn't really appreciate what the father has done, and at the end of the poem it's quite clear that he's almost rejecting the father now that the father has become weak. he doesn't want anything to do with the father. And we can see in this poem that the narrator is trying to break free from the mother, maybe because the mother is holding on too tight and they have decided to reject the mother in order to become something new, something independent.
Yeah, because in both of the poems, I mean, neither of the parents are presented as bad parents. In fact, they both seem like, you know, loving parents. I think it's just that sense of, which you can probably relate to, is as you get older, you just become keen to become your own person. What about walking away? I mean, we could probably link to that poem. Certainly there's a sense of hesitation, isn't there, and not being sure about the next step. But are there any differences or other similarities that we might be able to comment on?
In walking away, we know that the speakers from the parents' perspective, so we can see how difficult he's finding it to physically let go and walk away and let his son grow up and be his own person. The mothering distance is from the child's perspective, so we don't get all the sort of emotions and the feelings from the mother having to sort of and try to figure out how she's feeling, what she's gone through with regards to trying to accept the fact that she needs to let go.
Yeah, definitely. So hopefully that's been helpful for you. Make sure that you tune in next time when we'll be talking about that next poem. But that's all that we've got time for today. So thank you very much for your time. Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye.